Welcome back. This is Chris with Learn WebLogic Online. And this lesson, we're going to talk about WebLogic security. Now, there's no way that I can cover every security topic in a single lecture on security. There's just too many things to cover, from how you create, from how you set up your operating system to how you configure your network, install WebLogic, all the way up to application security. So it's a very broad topic. There's OS, networking, like I mentioned, application. It just goes on, and we cannot cover all these topics in a reasonable amount of time. So I'm going to highlight some very basic high-level concepts, and we'll touch on some operating system stuff, some networking stuff. We're really going to focus on securing a WebLogic domain and the resources within that domain. So this lesson will touch on certain topics and terminology within WebLogic. So let's start with the server host. Some of these may seem pretty obvious, but when you're installing WebLogic in a production environment, when you install the Oracle WebLogic product and create your domain, make sure that you're using proper operating system permissions to protect the data that's stored on disk. When I'm working in a production environment, or my teams are working in production environments, we install WebLogic and create domains using a dedicated operating system user in group, and it's only that user in group that has access to the WebLogic install and domain directories. And speaking of accounts, limit the number of accounts on your system. This is not just a WebLogic, guideline per se, but this is just a general operating system security guideline. The fewer accounts that you have on the box, the less likely that those accounts will be compromised. And as I mentioned earlier, create an operating system group that only contains the installation user, the domain creation and node manager user, and restrict access for that user to the Oracle home or WebLogic home or domain home directories. And you can do that through chrooting in Linux or Unix. So when you're installing WebLogic in a production environment, if you were to install everything with WebLogic, WebLogic comes with some example code, some sample code, sample databases, and it's not patched. So when you're performing a secure installation in a production environment, don't install the sample applications or code. When you perform an install, always install the bare minimum that meets your requirements. And so sample applications and code are an unnecessary risk in a production environment. Remove the Derby database after you've installed Oracle WebLogic. This is not an option when you install WebLogic. It is installed by default. Unless you're using Derby database in production, which I don't recommend since it's not a production quality database per se, a file-based database, remove it after you've installed it. And make sure that it's also removed from the startup of your domain. So by default, if you create a WebLogic domain using the configuration wizard, the startup scripts for WebLogic may create a Derby database instance. So you'll want to remove references in the startup scripts to any Derby databases. And most importantly, just like your computer or workstation, whether it's OS 10 or Linux or Microsoft Windows, you always want to patch your WebLogic install. So you can go to oracle.com, specifically support.oracle.com, and always apply the latest critical patch updates or CPUs. So Oracle has two types of patches. There are critical patch updates, which come out quarterly, which are typically security-related patches. And then there's patch set updates, which come out more frequently. And I'm not sure what the cycle is there, if it's once a quarter as well, or if it's more frequent. But a CPU includes critical security updates, and a PSU, or a patch set update, could be new product features, bug fixes, whatever it might be. It's a dot release of the product. So a couple things to keep in mind when you're creating a domain in a production environment. Always configure the domain for production mode. Production, by default, WebLogic domains are created in development mode. However, production applies a much more stringent security model against that WebLogic domain. So when you're using the configuration wizard to create your WebLogic domain, you can specify the mode at that time. And when you select production mode determines a different set of security and logging parameters than the default development mode. These are much more stringent than development mode. So for instance, when you deploy an application to a domain in production mode, you are required to specify a username and password for that deployment. And one other thing to keep in mind is that when you're issuing WebLogic scripting tool commands or WebLogic deployer commands or other WebLogic commands at the command line, omit the credentials when you're issuing those commands. In previous labs, we have deployed applications specifying the username and password at the command line, and that's a big security risk because you've now entered the credentials in plain text, they're not encrypted, and if I were to run a history of that command or list all the running processes, I could see those credentials in my history or through the results of running a PS on Linux or looking at Task Manager. So omit those credentials when you're issuing the commands. What will happen is that WebLogic scripting tool will then prompt you to enter those credentials. So leave out the username, leave out the password, and let WebLogic prompt you for that information. Now, with WebLogic scripting tool, we can also set up a user key store that has a private key in it that you can use to authenticate against WebLogic. And we'll cover that in the lab on WebLogic scripting tool. So after you've created your domain, there's several things that you can do to secure that domain. There's a lot of things actually, but we're going to touch on just a few of the more common ones here. So out of the box, WebLogic comes with a password validator. However, the password validator out of the box defines a very simple rule. So I recommend configuring this password validator to define a complex password rule for your production environment. For instance, a minimum of 8 characters and 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, and a symbol of some type. You should also configure user lockout, which defines after how many failed attempts that user will be locked out. You can define a time frame as well, so you can lock that user out indefinitely, or you can lock that user out for a specified amount of time, say 10, 15, 20 minutes. You should also configure Node Manager security. Now, we haven't talked about Node Manager yet. There's a separate lesson on server lifecycle using Node Manager. But if you don't know, Node Manager is a WebLogic process, a separate process that runs on each server that is used to start up and shut down WebLogic servers and to monitor their state. So if a node fails, if a WebLogic server fails, Node Manager can attempt to restart it or migrate that server over to a healthy host. So when I say configure Node Manager security, I'm talking about configuring SSL for Node Manager and defining a username and password for Node Manager as well, because you can connect to Node Manager using WebLogic scripting tool like you can with an admin server. Many production environments have requirements to audit security. WebLogic has an auditing security provider that is disabled by default, so I recommend enabling it. However, be careful because the auditing provider will generate a lot of information related to security events. So you can filter and specify what you want audited to limit the amount of information in that auditing log. By default, it'll audit every security action within WebLogic, every authorization, authentication, and identity assertion request, whether it was successful or not. So if you have it enabled, for instance, and somebody logs into your application, you will see the result of that authentication and authorization check within WebLogic. So for every resource that's protected within WebLogic, you will see an entry in the log file every time a user accesses that resource. So another thing you can do is disable remote mbean access. Again, this mbeans are something that we'll talk about in the WebLogic scripting tool lesson, but an mbean or management bean is used to monitor and manage and configure a resource within WebLogic. Every resource within WebLogic is represented by an mbean. There are server mbeans, there are application mbeans, there are data source mbeans, so on and so forth. There's an mbean server that runs inside of WebLogic, and by default, that can be remotely accessed. So while I think this is a low-risk security issue, especially if your solution's behind a firewall or in a DMZ, you can disable access to this mbean server, and instructions on how to do that are in the WebLogic 12c documentation online at oracle.com. This one's almost overlooked all the time. Out of the box, WebLogic doesn't define a message timeout. It is infinite, I believe. So I recommend setting the message timeout. So messages that are passed back and forth between applications and WebLogic resources, such as JMS message, have an indefinite timeout. I'd recommend setting a timeout so that way you limit your risk to a denial of service attack. And what we do is you basically cap how long a message can be sent so that you don't have someone malicious initializing several connections to WebLogic and sending messages indefinitely. And you can also enable something called max message size so that somebody doesn't send in a gigabyte sized JMS message. You can limit the size of that message to 5-10 megabytes or whatever's reasonable and required for your environment. Another important thing, use SSL or Secure Sockets Layer, also known as TLS. So you can configure WebLogic servers to listen and connect to each other using SSL. Now, there's one-way SSL and two-way SSL, and I won't dive into the underpinnings of SSL in this lesson. That's out of scope for this lesson. But SSL encrypts traffic to and from WebLogic. So if you have users logging into a web page in an application that's running on WebLogic and they enter a username and password, that'll be entered in as plain text if it's just plain HTTP. However, if you have SSL enabled, then those values will be encrypted because the connection to WebLogic is encrypted. Now, in some environments, some that I've worked in, we have a load balancer that sits on top of the enterprise environment. And that load balancer / firewall, which is an F5, big IP F5 firewall, will terminate SSL at the firewall and then route an unencrypted request to WebLogic. So clients or customers who are accessing an application on WebLogic have to go through this F5, this load balancer / firewall. And they do so using HTTPS. However, the F5 terminates SSL at that point when it hits the F5 and then routes it unsecured to WebLogic. The assumption is there is that the F5 is providing perimeter security for the application. And so therefore SSL is not necessarily required within the firewall, inside the firewall. Now, we could have debates back and forth about whether that's good or bad or the right thing to do, but that's just one type of architecture. However, you'll see later on there's what's called a domain-wide administration port, and we can separate application traffic from administration traffic. And typically you want to encrypt administration traffic because you're constantly sending credentials back and forth between WebLogic servers to perform management tasks. So I don't go into detail here on how to set up SSL. WebLogic comes with a dummy or demo SSL key store. So it includes an identity and trust that you can use to play with SSL out of the box. This is only available in development mode. In production mode, I believe WebLogic prevents you from using the demo certs. So you should never use the demo identity and demo trust key stores in a production environment. Every installation of WebLogic includes the same demo certs. So somebody could use those demo certs to attempt to establish an SSL connection to WebLogic in your environment. So don't use those. Generate your own certs, either through a self-signed cert or request one from your CA, your cert authority. So as I mentioned on the last slide, there's this additional listen port that WebLogic supports, and it's called the domain-wide admin port. Now, the domain-wide admin port's a little misleading, but because it's not really the same port number used across an entire WebLogic domain, the meaning here is that all administration traffic for all WebLogic servers goes over a dedicated port for administration traffic. I can configure a dedicated admin port for my domain, and that will separate admin traffic from application traffic. However, when you configure the domain-wide admin port, every server must configure an admin port. And when you do that, the admin port requires the configuration of SSL. So if you're in development mode within your domain, you can rely on the demo identity and demo trust that comes with WebLogic. This should already be pre-configured in your domain, and we'll go through this in the lab using the demo certs and configuring this admin port. So why is this admin port beneficial? So this admin port is separate from your default listen port, whether it's unsecure or secure. So when you configure this admin port, all administration traffic must go to this port. So for example, if I enable the admin port on the admin server and in the rest of my domain, I cannot access the admin server on the old default port, say 7001, which is the port that we've been using. I now need to access the admin console on the admin port. And that goes for any time that we need to connect to the admin server, whether it's the admin console or if we're running a script in the command line, like a WebLogic scripting tool or a Java WebLogic deployer. Typically, whenever we run a script, we connect to the admin server using that T3 : host port syntax. Well, we now need to specify the admin port in that syntax. So why use a domain-wide admin port? Well, it reduces the risk of an application or some process transmitting server configuration information in plain text. When you have an application deployed to WebLogic, that application is running and listening on either the unsecure or secure listen port within WebLogic. WebLogic will prevent that application from connecting and therefore transmitting any server configuration because the admin server port is locked down and only accessible by administrators and not applications. And since the admin port is secure, there's no way information can be transmitted in plain text because even if the application could connect to the admin port, that connection would be encrypted. And another big benefit is that the admin port provides a dedicated port and listening thread. So if you have a server with an application running on it, that application processing will not interfere with your ability to connect to that server on the admin port and perform whatever administration functions that you're performing. It's a separate thread altogether. If I had an application running on a server, and this can happen quite often, and that application is out of control, well, my application port and administration port are one and the same if I don't have an admin port defined. So let me say that again. If I've got an application running on a WebLogic server and that application is under heavy load, but I also want to administer that server, so the port is the same between performing administration tasks or the application running. So if the application is under heavy load and it's taxing the system, it may be difficult to connect to that managed server to perform administration tasks since there's only one listening thread. So having the dedicated admin port eliminates that risk. So here's a quick overview of what SSL looks like in WebLogic and what's supported in this diagram. And let's move from left to right here. So the admin server and managed servers support one- and two-way SSL between clients and the server. So in one-way SSL, which is what most of you are probably experienced with on the web when you log into a website, hopefully it's encrypted. With one-way SSL, the server presents a certificate to your browser, and the browser authenticates or verifies the authenticity of that certificate. In two-way SSL, not only do you get a certificate from the server, but you must present a certificate to the server as well. So you, the client, validate the cert from the server, and the server validates your certificate. And that is what two-way SSL is. So WebLogic does support that on the managed servers. However, if we look at communication to and from the node manager, only one-way SSL is supported. And communication between the admin server and managed servers is only one way as well. Unless you've got some crazy security requirements in your environment, I don't recommend using two-way SSL unless you have hardware accelerators in your environment that can perform the SSL handshake or the encryption or the encrypt-decrypt of the SSL certificates, because there's a lot of overhead involved, CPU processing involved when it comes to performing the two-way SSL handshake.